Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this final video lecture in the Congressional Debate How-To series. Today, we're going to be talking about how to prepare speeches. So this is the most general topic we probably have, but I think a really important one to cover, especially for newer students who may not be accustomed to doing a lot of research or a lot of speech creation in any of their past classes. So I really hope that you guys take a lot from this lecture. And of course, at the end of the day, this is merely a suggestion on what you can do. If you develop your own system that you feel works better for you, then by all means continue in that system. But especially when you're starting out, I think it is helpful to heed the advice of people who are more experienced before you start trying to venture out on your own. So with all that out of the way, here's the step-by-step process. This is incredibly important in congressional debate, given the fact that the debate really is about the legislation. It's not about the problem. It's not about the status quo. It's about how the legislation is doing and whether it'll be better or worse for the world. I think a lot of congressional debaters, especially new ones, forget this issue, and they just assume that we should go on the affirmative to do something about a terrible issue. And of course, every issue needs some sort of a solution, but Congress is really focused on providing a good solution rather than any solution. So it's really important to focus on the legislation and only move on from this step when you can answer any question about the legislation, about what parts they have, about what it's doing, why it's important, things like that. I put a couple of sample questions here. So after you read the whole legislation, truly understand what the legislation does, how it does it, and why it does it, then you can open up your computer or whatever source of information you're going to use to research for your speech and go to Wikipedia for background research. Before I move on, I need to preface this by saying you should never cite Wikipedia. But all of your English teachers, I kind of disagree with them, all of your science teachers. I do believe that Wikipedia, when used correctly, is a good source of information. What you should never be doing is basing all of your material solely off Wikipedia or an encyclopedia or something like that. Use these kind of sites to build up a foundation of knowledge about generally what is happening, why it's happening, how it's happening, who's involved, things like that. And then from there, you can start to create your arguments. So read the page on whatever the problem the legislation is trying to solve. So for example, if it's like a foreign policy bill about increasing aid to Afghanistan, then maybe search up US's involvement in Afghanistan in the past as a Wikipedia article and see what that article can provide to you in terms of information. Usually there'll be a lot of great info on these articles, and they'll develop, like I said, the foundation for you to understand other different arguments. And doing this work initially in your stages of your career will help you in the long term because you'll already have developed that foundation of knowledge. You can move on from this step when you can reasonably explain the conflict and its relation to the legislation, right? I would also recommend that don't just stick to one Wikipedia article. If there's a Wikipedia article for a solution, read that as well, right? You want to create that foundational knowledge first. Once you've done that, then you can use the Wikipedia hyperlinks to go to specific articles and read them. What you'll notice a lot is that Wikipedia will have like a superscript 1, like this little small 1 above the word. That's a source for what is being said in Wikipedia. So for example, if there's a really nice statistic that you found in a Wikipedia article, you can press that link and find the direct source from where Wikipedia got that number. And then you can use that as a source in your speech later on. I think this is a really good idea, especially when you're starting off and don't know much about a topic, to use the Wikipedia hyperlinks to find these statistics. Also, you can use Google to just find articles that answer any concept you didn't understand. Again, we really want to focus on background information first, because the more that you develop your foundational background understanding of all of these topics, the easier speech writing will be in the future, because you already know what you're going to talk about. If you completed the last step properly, you should know what the AF and neg arguments generally are. whether it's about the environment, whether it's the economy, whether it's about saving human lives, any other of these issues, you would generally know what they are if you do these steps correctly. And this bolsters your background information and helps you find stats that you can use in your speech. So those are really important. Next step is to use the statistics you find and connect it back to the legislation. Again, you can find these statistics either through the Wikipedia page using the hyperlinks, or if you're finding a specific statistic, you can search directly on Google, reading journal articles, whatever the case is. But point being that you need to first find your data and then come up with an argument that is reasonable. And you always, again, need to connect it back to the legislation. This is where we're going to create the analysis, impact, and warrant, the logic behind your point. Analysis, again, following a brief description, a link between your evidence and the rest of the legislation in your speech, and the impact, why this really matters, the humanization aspect of these particular arguments. Now you've found the foundation of your point, the evidence, you can make the connection to the rest of the legislation. So I want to keep stressing this enough, because sometimes a lot of students will complain that they can't find evidence. The issue is that they are thinking of arguments first and trying to find the evidence later. You should always find the evidence first and then make your arguments later, because the evidence is most important to support the rest of the argument. Bad evidence leads to bad arguments. So you want to make sure you find good evidence, so then your arguments will be good as well. Fifth step is just to review this point and make sure that you have an active claim. Now you're creating the claim. You should now have one completed point. So congratulations, you started off with evidence, then you moved on to an analysis, impact, and warrant. And then once you reviewed your whole argument, you can now make an active claim to describe what exactly you're trying to argue for. And now you have one completed point. Now is the hard part, to repeat the above steps until you have two separate points. So again, that's just finding statistics, putting analysis, impacts, and warrants in there, and then making an active claim. So until you have 2 points, continue this process. Next, you want to get to step 7, finding an AGD that works for you and making your introduction and conclusion. Refer back to my AGD introduction video if you have any questions about how to find or make an AGD, but this should be pretty simple if you've watched that video. Now you have a completed speech. So congratulations if this is the first time that you're watching this, and congrats, you just made your first speech in congressional debate. Now the task is to put that speech on a legal pad. So typically when I'm planning out my speeches, I'll write in more detail on a Google document or a Microsoft Word on my computer, and then I'll transcribe what I want onto my legal pad. If you find that writing directly on the legal pad works better for you, then by all means take that approach. I just want to limit the amount of mistakes I make on my legal pad, so I'd end up writing it online first and then putting it on the legal pad. But a key thing to note here is that you never want to fully write out your speech. Only bullet points or brief descriptions and notes should be on your legal pad. Like I said in a previous lecture, your legal pad should not last any longer than 1 page. Again, never write word for word, only write short fragments and extemp the rest. Again, we want to really focus on speaking to the audience. You're only able to do that when you're not reciting memorized lines, but instead giving extemporaneous answers. Next, 9th, practice the speech as much as possible and make sure that you are under time. Just as a brief review from the first lecture, you have 30 seconds for the intro, then you have 1 minute and 10 seconds for each point, finally 10 seconds for the conclusion. So in general, the way that I would go about this whole process, if I were to sum it down into simple keywords, is you start with the legislation. Once you understand the legislation, then you do background research. Once you understand the background research, you look for evidence. Once you find evidence, you create your warrant, analysis, and impact all at the same time, followed by, after reviewing the rest of your argument, creating an active claim, and then adding an introduction and conclusion as the cherries on the top of your speech. And that's about it. I'd like to really thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you've tuned into even one of my videos, or really thank you if you've watched all 11 or so of these videos. They took a lot of effort to put together, and I really hope that with these videos you have learned even one small thing that may make you a better congressional debater in the future. So for the final time, this is Murtaza Kazmi signing off on the Congressional Debate How-To series. And I hope to see you some other time, hopefully with you winning congressional debate rounds. So anyways, goodbye, take care.